violent breakdowns, self-inflicted injuries, and even death. Kowai Shashin is a PS1 game released exclusively in Japan and under some of the strangest circumstances in video game history. It's one of a handful of games over the years that's developed a reputation for being more than that. More than a game in the sense that something a lot darker is said to follow it. It's one of my absolute favourite examples of what's now known as a cursed game, in large part because it's not necessarily as cut and dry as it might seem. Really, the only thing we know for certain is that the developers set out with the goal of creating a visual novel that follows the story of Hiyori, a professional exorcist that specialises in releasing trapped spirits from haunted photographs. At the very least, we know that to be true, but from here on out is where the story takes a turn. Spaced out in between the narrative sections of the game are a kind of point-and-click rhythm section. You're prompted to search a given photograph for any kind of abnormality, and then press a sequence of timed button combinations to trigger an incantation and banish the demon from the picture. If you're just now seeing these images for the first time, you might be struck by how eerily mundane they appear, jarringly out of place, as if they're in the wrong game. In comparison to the game's otherwise exaggerated, cutesy anime aesthetic, they're all very candid. Ominously so. A shot of a person, group of people, or a landscape, all things that look as if they could have been taken by anyone, from anywhere. So much so that when you really fixate on them for any amount of time, you start to feel this uneasy sense that there must be a reason for that there must be something more to them. And that's likely because they're all supposedly real. Real photographs of real people, each with their own tragic or morbid backstory. Some say that the developers had the idea to use real photographs first and then just built the game around that idea, while others argue that they just needed anything to fill in the gaps, and that real images were just the most convenient option. There's a theory out there that none of them are real in the sense that they were staged by the development team and that the entire premise was created for publicity, the game having come out around the time of other massively popular cursed media projects like Ringu or the Blair Witch Project would seem to support that. I just can't quite bring myself to believe it. If only just because going out and taking this series of images would have taken considerably more effort and work than it would have been to just source them from some magazine, video, or urban legend web forum, which is where they're all supposedly from. Cursed images aren't exactly rare or hard to find even today, but lending infinitely more credibility to their claim is the fact that some of them, at least, are actually very easily proven to be from video and magazines from around the time. It needs to be said though that I don't think we'll ever be able to track all of them down to know for certain, and that's for a variety of reasons, not least of all just because the game is the only source of them we have. An inherent issue with that is that they're not exactly an accurate representation of what we're looking for. Likely due to the simple nature of them, for the game to work, the developers needed to overlay them with their own spooky assets. In most cases, just for the player to have something to interact with. Things like ghosts, demons, apparitions are all tastelessly and clumsily jammed anywhere they would fit. And I absolutely understand why that was necessary. It just makes the images extremely frustrating to reverse search or inquire about online. No one is claiming that any of the edited elements of the game are real. I don't think anyone has ever argued that. And similarly, no one has ever even really suggested that the images are cursed to begin with. What I think this ultimately actually comes down to is just whether or not these are real photographs in the sense that they were sourced from people who at least claimed there was some kind of tragic backstory associated with them. And I personally don't find that hard to believe at all. Needless to say, there are some out there that claim to have had unfortunate and hard to believe things happen to them after playing the game, but I'm not sure they're the reason it's gained the underground infamy that it now has. The belief tends to be that out of the entire library of images that are visible in-game, at least one of them is actually real. and this time I do mean cursed, and that by using it and distributing it like this, offensively plastering it with all their weird esoteric characters and symbols, the developers are said to have genuinely upset something, and suffered for it. The relatively small development studio, Media Entertainment, would go bankrupt shortly after its release, but in addition to that, the development process was said to have been intensely traumatic for everyone involved. There are a couple of cases of alleged spontaneous mental breakdowns during playtesting, employees having to be removed or hospitalized, specifically in one instance where, without any reason, a manager was said to have cut one of their fingers off, or so the story goes. Most tragically and perhaps famously of all though, being when someone would supposedly take their own life, doing so in a subway bathroom one station away from one that was depicted in an image from the game. Whether it's real or not, one lesser known but fascinating fact that I've always thought made this whole thing a lot more believable was that playtesters seem to have an issue with one stage in particular. So much so that there's actually a debug code left in the final release that doesn't have any other purpose than to skip that one stage specifically, and none of the others. Again, these stories are impossible to verify, so we'll never know for sure, perhaps most tragically of all just because Japanese game development is so full of cases like these anyway. So if nothing else, it's something fascinating to just think about, to sit with. Because you have to wonder, if this doesn't have at least some basis in reality, then what did actually happen? And more importantly, why? What is it about these mundane images that makes the game so unsettling? And if they weren't found online, then where did they come from? From a waking nightmare to the surreal landscapes of your unconscious mind, the vast majority of Yume Nikki fan games are such incredibly well made and fascinating little experiences that I honestly don't think it's possible to recommend just one of them. But in the case of LCDDEM, it's not even possible to recommend just one of them. In particular, in a series or genre so heavily defined by its atmosphere, I think it speaks volumes that it manages to be so significantly different in that respect without losing any of the hypnotic and ethereal feelings that I feel are the core idea of dream simulators. It's a much more subtle experience in my opinion, but not necessarily in any kind of way that would stand out when put next to any of the others, just in a way in which I think it really matters most. Nowadays, this style of dream exploration game is so synonymous with how overtly dark and nightmarish they are, that from simply taking a step back from that, it's made this much more refreshing and unique take. That's not to say that I don't personally enjoy that side of them, or that the game doesn't eventually build up to those themes anyway, but for the most part, it's anything but that. The dreams all take place in these calm, peaceful, serene worlds. There's gardens, parks, full-sized explorable aquariums, dimly lit rooms of brightly coloured stained glass. The point being, nowhere I wouldn't actually want to be myself, especially considering the fact that there aren't any enemies that pursue you through them, and so it loses a sense of the urgency that was present in the other games. If nothing else, it serves to exaggerate the darker and more intense scenes when they are eventually used, but its most noticeable effect is in just how much more calming and almost meditative it's able to be. These are all reasons why I love the game as much as I do, but the most fascinating aspect of it by far has to be the reasons behind its now infamous reputation. A reputation that precedes anything to do with the actual game itself. In the already most mysterious corner of the internet, it's easily the strangest therein, because chances are, if you do know the name already, you also know that there tends to be this shadow that follows it. wherever it goes. A kind of curse that's inflicted on anyone who even so much as speaks the name. Although no one has ever really been able to agree on why. It's here that I should probably warn you, you'll find countless far-fetched rumours and baseless theories just like that all over the internet, and from people trying to make this a lot deeper than I think it actually is. The truth is, all we really know for certain is that the developer is just a really disturbed individual, with many personal issues that are quite honestly none of my business, but that's given them this bizarre outlook on their own work. They'd made a name for themselves previously as a contributor to the Yume Tuki project, specifically as a music producer and sound design artist. As you can imagine, naturally, that meant that they gained a lot more attention online than they previously had, but ironically, it would be their response to this attention that would make them infinitely more of a spectacle. The rules were, you were allowed to use, distribute, sell any of their music in any project you'd like, but you weren't allowed to credit them. And you weren't allowed to tell anyone in any way where or who the music had come from. As strange as that might have been though, it was far from where that bizarre philosophy would peak, as around 3 or so years after the initial release of LCDDEM, they'd suddenly, and seemingly with no real reason, pull every available download link and wipe their online presence entirely, leaving only this single bizarre page on their official website, explicitly and ominously ordering everyone to remove any and all links, images, and mention of the game. Most importantly, telling everyone to forget it even ever existed. As strange as it might be, it's something that I've chosen to at least partly honour to this day, so out of respect I won't say their name and I won't tell you where to find the game, but I've also given you its name. So if it's something you for some reason really wanted to go out of your way to find, there's no reason you couldn't. To this day, they've never given us any reason at all for this, but if it wasn't their intention for it to have the opposite effect and they actually just wanted it deleted, then needless to say, it was easily the dumbest way to go about it. It resulted in an explosion of rumours, myths, and urban legends, most of which just being wild, elaborate theories with no basis in reality whatsoever, but it's undeniable that because of that, the game is infinitely more popular than it would have been otherwise. Some theories are that the game tells a story of a traumatic event they went through personally, and that by being associated with it, they're constantly reminded of it, but others take a more superstitious view, stating that the game took on a life of its own, tormenting them, haunting them, and that out of desperation they just don't want anything to do with it anymore. From what I can find online, that tends to come from the effect it supposedly has on you if you were to play the game at a certain time of night and in a certain frame of mind. I'm not someone who usually believes in those kinds of things, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't immensely curious. So to cut a long story short, I did try it, and I can confidently say that at least where that's concerned, I haven't experienced anything myself. For a time, a personal theory of mine was that it could have had something to do with the legality of distributing a game like this. You might remember how fan games and ROM hacks from this era always seem to be in constant competition with each other to be the darkest, most edgy and shocking game out there. Brutal Doom specifically being an example of a game that incorporated real gore and shock images into its art assets, in some kind of attempt to push what they saw as boundaries. And so I have to wonder, what kind of horrific and potentially illegal content could possibly be in the game that would have made the developer frantically delete everything and vanish out of fear of backlash? Nowadays, however, I just can't see that being the case, considering how well explored the world of LCDDEM is. And so, unfortunately, until we hear from them personally, it will forever remain a mystery. Because of the seemingly constant stream of re-releases in recent years, I think most people are now aware of the 90s point-and-click game Harvester, But tragically, I don't think anyone really understands it. In my opinion, it's easily the realest cursed game out there, if only just because of the undeniably sickening atmosphere that's present in practically every inch of the thing. It's so slimy and gross in so many ways, and despite how much I might genuinely love certain aspects of it, I've never been able to push through that to see them in any real capacity. But perhaps even worse still, are the reasons for that. I should probably start with the positives and say that the world Harvester takes place in, otherwise known as the town of Harvest, is absolutely amazing. One of the most visually striking, intricate and unique high-concept environments ever created, in my opinion, even to this day. In this early 3D pre-rendered style, with all these overly reflective surfaces plastered with tiled photo-sourced textures, you'd be forgiven for initially thinking that its look is just a product of its time. Which it is, sure, but amazingly, through playing the game, you eventually learn that it's actually a very deliberate style created intentionally to look like this. To look oddly fake. Which is something that I've always found extremely impressive, because to do that, they would have had to have known that it didn't look real even back when this visual style was cutting edge. All the digitized actors and physical props set against these eerie, unnatural backgrounds create this immediately obvious contrast between them, as if you're watching real people wander through the digital hellscape of Harvest. And that's most likely because you are. From what I found online, the concept came largely from the mind of writer-director Gilbert Austin, which is bizarre enough as it is, but something I've always found even stranger still is how he talks about the game in interviews, almost as if it came to him in some kind of trance-like state. To spoil the game in its entirety, it's eventually revealed to you that the town of Harvest isn't a town at all, rather an entirely digital computer simulation. A simulation deliberately designed from the ground up to be so unbelievably sick and twisted that by trapping someone within it, you can mentally break them, turning them into real-world depraved lunatics, serial killers, or worse. In all fairness, as far as video game plots go, that's relatively tame, but it takes a turn when the game points the camera at you, and you realise that the whole time, the game you are playing, Harvester, is actually that program intended to work on you. So obviously, leaving it at weird would massively understate just how truly insane this game actually is, even at a conceptual level. But unfortunately, if it stopped there, it would hardly be worth even mentioning. As you can probably imagine, that being the case, the game is anything but subtle. I'll spare you from the worst of it, but from what you're seeing in these clips, I think you can probably make an accurate enough guess as to some of its themes. Simply put, some of the game's more uncomfortable scenes are genuinely disturbing, and despite the fact that we now know that was the point, it doesn't make the game any less excruciating to sit through. I don't think I'm qualified enough to argue whether or not these extremes have their place in art, so if it's the case that games like this are just a necessary part of free expression, I'm also more than happy to admit that they're just not for me. Because regardless of whether or not you even believe it's possible, the unsettling part of this story comes from the simple fact that, as far as they were concerned, at least once, it actually worked. In 2010, the actor that plays the game's protagonist was arrested for some really sick stuff. I'll leave it at that. Perhaps the most chilling part of all being that after all this time, his haircut, outfit, look, is still that of his in-game persona, as if he himself had become Steve Mason from Harvester. Now, the reason I know all of this to begin with is obviously because I would have had to have played the game myself. So I guess you just have to take my word for it when I say that I don't feel any different at least. But I think that's ultimately, by far, the most effective aspect of it. The paranoia that comes from having to self-evaluate like that. Because if what it's saying is true, then how would I even know? How would anyone know? I personally don't believe that any one game can realistically have this kind of effect on just anyone, but I'd be lying if I said that it didn't make me wonder. Wonder what effect it's had out there in the time since its release. If only the tiniest nudge is an excuse for someone already capable of something like that. And could it really be cursed, at least in that sense? Again, although anything has the potential to do that, nothing has ever really claimed responsibility for it in this way. If it wasn't for morbid curiosity, or had I even known the subject to begin with, I'm not sure that it would have been a game that I would have played at all, to be honest. That's not to say that it's a bad game, or that it has no value whatsoever. I just really can't find any reason to recommend it, which I have to admit is something I'm finding really hard to justify considering everything I've said here. Why I choose to draw the line here, I really couldn't tell you. Every other game I've discussed had some kind of tragedy associated with it, or worse. Harvester is really only the most extreme example of that. But then again, was that not what I was looking for? So the only thing I can come out of this, having really learned, is that if you go looking for something, the worst that can happen is that you just might find it.